Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Brendan with EVOQ Bike. So I want to talk about base miles for crit racing, and more importantly, the aerobic metabolism for really hard efforts. This video is coming about because I made a comment on the channel before that even for crit racers in the US, you want to be able to produce energy aerobically. And someone said, but if I'm smashing out of every corner and going anaerobic, what does that have to do with the aerobic metabolism? I think it's a great question. So in this video, 4 main points that we want to talk about. You want to be able to produce more power by burning more fuel. And we're going to talk about this. So number 1, why do you want a strong aerobic metabolism when these races for most people are less than an hour? Some longer pro crits are an hour and a half. Shout out to the Savage Rochester crit in my hometown, which used to be 2 hours. I don't know if it's that long anymore. Number 2, who wants on the other end of the spectrum a high anaerobic capacity or high VLaMax? They're not the same thing, but for the extent of this video, I'm not going to use them interchangeably, but more anaerobic produced energy, we'll call it. Number 3, what does the big aerobic base that you hear people talking about in base miles, and we have a big endurance video on that if you're not sure what base miles are, what does that do for you besides improving your long endurance rides? This might actually surprise you because it wasn't very intuitive to me. And then number 4, an interval trick that I learned when I was working with the guys from inscyd for how to execute your intervals better, we'll call it. And really it's consuming lactate in between the intervals. And we'll talk about that. Very quickly, shout out to our new YouTube subscribers, Grant, Daryl, Paul, Bvan, Vaz, Jonathan, Serkin, another John, and Cycling Zone 5. We're not going to be talking about Zone 5 today much, but everybody welcome. If you're new to the channel, please like the video and subscribe. If you're listening on Apple or iTunes, please leave us a 5-star review if you think we've earned it. If you don't think we have, email me, brendan@evoq.bike, and let me know why you think this sucks. Okay, so when we're talking about crits, and this is also going to apply to road races, but riders generate lactate every time we jump out of a corner, or even in a road race, when there's a flurry of attacks and you're going well above VO2 max, you're going to be producing lactate. You're always producing lactate though, even on an endurance ride, but on those rides, it's such a small amount and the aerobic system gobbles it up that we don't notice that feeling when the lactate gets broken down and there's that hydrogen ion that creates the burn in our legs that is like, ow, I don't really want to pedal anymore. So the glycolytic metabolism produces lactate. The aerobic metabolism consumes lactate. So very quickly, you can see if you are producing lactate from glycolytic energy production when you're smashing out of a corner, but then your aerobic metabolism is consuming the lactate, we should be able to stop the video right now. That should be enough of a reason why we're now seeing, hey, I need to be able to consume this lactate that I'm producing in this race. Again, road racing, repeated attacks, gravel racing. If you're at the pointy end of a gravel race, shout out to James Walsh. We had the conversation in the podcast and he said, hey man, this channel is one of the few that talk about the hard efforts in gravel. Everyone says, oh, gravel is going to be just this long aerobic endurance ride in zone 2, 3. If you're at the pointy end, it is nothing like that. So back to the race. We're going to produce these huge bouts of lactate. You're smashing, you're bridging, you might get caught in the washing machine and you're fighting for a position a little bit more. When there's the less intense moments, that's when you're going to consume the lactate that you're producing. Otherwise, at some point, you're going to blow and you're out the back. And this is when the lactate is transferred from the fast twitch fibers to the slow twitch fibers, it is consumed. There's one key, this is actually number 4 for the interval trick that I learned when I was working with the inscyd guys a few years ago, is that when you are pedaling, that's when you're consuming the most lactate. So in between your intervals, zone 2 or even high zone 2 is when you're going to consume the most lactate without making yourself more fatigued for the next effort. So the same thing, if you're in a race, keep spinning in between those hard efforts, you're going to consume more of the lactate, which is going to obviously make you last longer in the race. Don't just coast. Okay. So number one, the first question, why do we want a strong aerobic metabolism if these are short 1 hour races? If you have a huge aerobic base, a big aerobic foundation, and watch the endurance video that I'll post, if you have not seen that goes into exactly what's happening physiologically in our bodies, you can make those big jumps and these big glycolytic efforts, and your aerobic system that is very large now will consume that lactate. This is going to give you a better sprint, a better finishing move from 1K out at the end versus someone who is not aerobically trained, versus the athlete who only does 1 or 2 hour rides because they think, oh, I only have to do 1 or 2 hour races. That's all I need. You can get by on that, but they are definitely not their fastest version of themselves. They are going to be more fatigued at the finish, have more fatigue and metabolites in their system, and you will have a greater fatigue resistance if you are aerobically trained. Said differently, if you are poorly aerobically trained, or if you have a naturally high VLaMax, you naturally produce most energy through the glycolytic system. You can throttle insane watts, but you don't have the metabolism to consume that lactate. Okay. So that brings us to number two. Who would want to have these massive anaerobic producing engines or a really high VLaMax? Just think of the exact opposite scenario. Who's doing these one-off efforts? True Grand Tour sprinters, just max force, huge watts, one effort at the end. They don't care how much lactate they produce because the race is over. Or you have some track sprinters that have events where it's one-off effort and then they're done. They don't have repeated efforts like crits, road races, gravel, cyclocross, every other aerobic focused discipline in cycling. Okay. So Sebastian Weber made a comment that was really interesting one time too. If you do have a high VLaMax, that's a really interesting thing when you also have a really high VO2 max, because lactate is the fuel for the aerobic metabolism. So you produce all this lactate, but then the VO2 max, the aerobic system uses it up. Number three, what does the big aerobic base do for you? We've kind of already answered this, but more direct, the answer is the more aerobic you are as an athlete, the more fuel you burn. The more fuel you burn, the more power you have to produce and put out and crush on the bike. It's that easy. Sebastian also gave a really good example on a podcast with Colby Pierce, where he said, this is like a cooling system for a car, right? You want to get more oxygen in to burn more fuel and put out more power. It's the same exact thing. And then number four, we already answered. What's the interval trick? It's the same thing for in races. Keep pedaling in between intervals. You know, the one thing that becomes tricky for me, I've talked about where I do my VO2 max intervals. It's in a valley, so I have a small gradual climb that helps me stay on the gas and put out the watts. I don't want something super steep because I can't pedal down that and keep consuming that lactate that I've produced. So a shallow gradient is better for me, for anyone, when you're doing these intervals, and use the same mentality in a race. Sometimes you think, I don't want to pedal. You want to keep pedaling. So what's next? I want to help with structuring what I had before as 5 blocks to racing. I've made comments before that I don't think it was totally dialed. And I'm going to put this into Training Peaks, where it's going to have lifting. It's going to have how you should structure base miles. And I want to redesign it, but it's not people always say training is not sexy. There's not a ton of intervals. You want to be getting the most amount of volume that you can get. And I'll probably base it around like a medium volume plan. So let's say 12 hours a week. And I know we all want to train. Most of us do. I love training more than racing, but it's aerobic training. And we can talk about, I had a great conversation with a guy about skiing who lives in Wisconsin. He's like, I might try skiing. I'm like, definitely. That your heart doesn't know the difference. Go ski. It's aerobic. And my last thank you is to people who have given me comments and feedback, and people have been super stoked about the athlete packs that we've been putting out. We had put out the endurance pack. We put out the VO2 max pack, which has had the most responses so far. And then I'm going to put out the time crunched athlete. Super shout out to Landry, who has helped me with this. And we're really excited for just trying to help you guys with more ways to get faster, guides, workouts, videos. If you need something from us, hit us up, Brendan at EVOQ.bike. and we will talk to you soon. Good luck with your training. See ya.